It was just another day in the courthouse, a space filled with the sounds of footsteps and the rustling of papers. Judge William Harper, a man known for his no-nonsense approach, sat at his desk, preparing for the steady stream of cases that were about to unfold. His routine was predictable: traffic violations, minor misdemeanors, and the occasional petty dispute. He'd seen it all before. Each day, he delivered swift judgments, his authority unquestioned, his decisions final. The cases to him were just another part of the system that demanded efficiency. Nothing ever really stood out. The clerk called the next case, and Harper glanced up, his gaze sweeping over the room, settling on the defendant. Cassandra Brown stepped forward. At first glance, she seemed no different from the other people who found themselves in his courtroom. Nervous, slightly disheveled, with an air of quiet compliance. She was a black woman, dressed modestly in a simple blouse and slacks, her hair pulled back into a neat bun. Her eyes, however, were calm, almost unsettlingly so. She looked at the judge without the usual nervousness or submission. There was something steady in her demeanor that caught Harper's attention for only a brief moment before he quickly dismissed it. "Miss Brown, you're here for a traffic violation," Judge Harper began, his voice flat. "You failed to signal a lane change on Main Street last week. The fine is $250. Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Cassandra nodded and took a step forward, but there was no desperation in her movement. She didn't try to justify herself or explain the situation. She didn't protest the fine or ask for leniency. Instead, she simply said, "No, Your Honor, I accept the fine." Her voice was steady, calm, but there was an undercurrent of something more that Harper couldn't quite place. She wasn't trying to argue or get out of the penalty. She wasn't even trying to plead her case. She just accepted it. To Harper, that was strange. Most people tried to make excuses. Most people were defensive, especially when money was involved. He couldn't help but wonder why she wasn't reacting the way most people did in this position. He glanced down at the paperwork in front of him, not looking at her directly, and then made his decision. "Very well. $250 fine. Please take it up with the clerk on your way out." With that, the case was closed. Harper didn't give it a second thought as Cassandra quietly turned and left the courtroom. There was no protest, no drama, just the soft shuffle of her shoes against the tiled floor. But as she walked out, Harper couldn't shake the feeling that he had missed something. The way she carried herself, the way she spoke without a hint of fear or hesitation, it wasn't like the others. He pushed the thought aside, ready for the next case. After all, it was just another routine hearing. But Cassandra Brown wasn't just another defendant, and something about her lingered in the back of his mind, even as the courtroom returned to its normal rhythm. As Cassandra left the courtroom, her mind was already far from the legal proceedings that had just unfolded. The $250 fine barely registered in her thoughts. It was a minor inconvenience at best. She had been in far more intense situations than this. The courtroom, with its formality and stern judgment, was just another part of a world that didn't fully understand her. The moment the doors closed behind her, Cassandra's expression softened. She had learned long ago how to play the part in front of those who didn't know her. Her calm demeanor, her lack of reaction, was a mask, a carefully crafted shield that kept people from seeing the complexity of who she truly was. Most people, like Judge Harper, only saw the surface. A black woman, quietly accepting her fate, moving through life without making waves. They had no idea that she was a leader in one of the most significant military restructuring projects of the decade. In the quiet of the hallway, Cassandra stopped for a moment to collect herself. Her mind flickered to the army and the mission that consumed her. She had been selected to lead an initiative that would change the entire structure of the armed forces, something so monumental that it would take years to fully execute. She wasn't just a strategist. She was a visionary. But none of that was visible to those who only knew her as a civilian dealing with a traffic violation. Her work was about innovation, about breaking down barriers in a system that had long relied on outdated methods. She had been tasked with transforming the military into a force that was not only more efficient but more inclusive, a system that reflected the diversity and complexity of the modern world. Every decision she made had far-reaching consequences, and she carried the weight of it all quietly, without complaint. People who worked with her knew her for her intelligence and unshakable resolve, but those outside of that circle, like Judge Harper, would never understand the scope of her work. Cassandra's path to this leadership role had been anything but ordinary. She wasn't born into privilege or power. She had risen through the ranks by sheer merit, breaking down walls and dismantling expectations at every turn. She had proven herself time and again, not by shouting or demanding attention, but by letting her results speak for themselves. Her ability to think critically, to adapt, and to lead with a quiet but firm hand had earned her the respect of even the most skeptical military officials. As she continued walking through the courthouse, her thoughts shifted back to the judge. She could feel the subtle weight of his assumptions hanging in the air. He had seen her as just another defendant, just another face in the crowd. But he had no idea who she really was. He had no idea that this woman standing before him was part of a revolution, one that would redefine the future of the military. She wasn't angry. No, Cassandra understood this was how the world worked. People often saw what they expected to see, and it was up to her to continue pushing forward, regardless of their perceptions. The world might not understand her, but that was never her concern. She had bigger things to focus on. As Cassandra stepped out of the courthouse, the city around her felt like a distant backdrop. She moved with purpose, her thoughts far from the mundane details of a traffic ticket. Her mind was focused on the bigger picture, the work that had brought her to this point, the work that would ultimately change the way an entire institution functioned. Flashbacks began to form in her mind, taking her back to the early days of her military career. She had never intended to join the military, but the opportunity had come at a time when she was seeking purpose. What had started as a decision based on practicality, an outlet to further her education and gain stability, had quickly turned into a calling. Cassandra had a natural affinity for strategy, a gift for understanding systems and processes that others overlooked. She was not the typical soldier, nor was she ever content to be merely a cog in the machine. Her rise had been swift but deliberate. She had started as a junior officer, assigned to logistical operations, where she quickly recognized inefficiencies that others had accepted as the norm. Instead of following orders blindly, she began to propose better ways to allocate resources, optimize planning, and streamline communication. Her ideas, often unconventional, were initially met with skepticism, but her results spoke louder than her critics. One of her most significant breakthroughs came when she identified flaws in the military's training systems. The existing structure was antiquated, relying heavily on methods that were decades old and ill-suited to modern warfare. Cassandra suggested integrating new technologies and teaching methods that emphasized agility and adaptability. While the proposal was controversial at first, she persisted, eventually gaining support from high-ranking officials who recognized her potential. It wasn't long before she was tapped for a special project, an initiative that would redefine the entire structure of the armed forces. Now, Cassandra was the head of a top-secret task force, responsible for a complete overhaul of the military. The scope of her work was enormous. It wasn't just about weapons and tactics. It was about creating a system that was flexible enough to handle the rapidly evolving nature of global conflicts. She was working to ensure that the Army wasn't just a reactive force, but a proactive one, anticipating the challenges of tomorrow. Her vision was one of inclusivity, incorporating diverse perspectives, backgrounds, and skills to create a more well-rounded and effective military. But despite the monumental nature of her role, few knew the details. To the outside world, Cassandra was just a quiet, composed woman moving through life. But those who worked with her knew better. They knew that behind her calm exterior was a mind constantly working, constantly evolving, seeking ways to make the impossible possible. As Cassandra reflected on her journey, she knew that her work was just beginning. The challenge ahead was monumental, but it was the challenge that had driven her from the start. She wasn't concerned about the opinions of others. She wasn't concerned about being understood. What mattered was that she was making real change, and no matter how many people underestimated her, she would continue to push forward, one calculated step at a time. Days after Cassandra's quiet exit from the courtroom, Judge William Harper couldn't shake the image of her calm, composed presence. At first, he had dismissed it as nothing more than the unremarkable behavior of someone who had accepted her fate. But as the hours passed, something about her continued to linger in his thoughts, as if the case hadn't been quite as simple as it had seemed at the time. He couldn't figure out why he felt this way, but the unease was undeniable. Later that afternoon, as he prepared for the next batch of cases, Harper sat down at his desk and started reviewing the paperwork of the day's upcoming defendants. His eyes skimmed over names and offenses with the practiced indifference of someone accustomed to the routine. But then, his gaze froze as he read Cassandra Brown's name again, not in relation to the traffic fine, but in a completely different context. It was a notification from a government office, a report on the Army's restructuring initiative. He blinked, disbelief taking hold for a moment. This was the same Cassandra Brown, the one who had stood before him just days earlier. His mind raced as he reread the document in front of him, absorbing the details of her involvement in one of the most ambitious and high-level military projects in recent history. Cassandra Brown, it turned out, was not just a traffic violator, as he had so easily labeled her, but a key figure in reshaping the very foundation of the armed forces. The document detailed her position as the leader of a massive initiative to modernize the military, improve its capabilities, and make it more inclusive. She was responsible for a complete overhaul of training methods, technology integration, and strategic planning, all aimed at ensuring the military could adapt to future challenges. Harper sat back in his chair, stunned. The realization hit him like a jolt. How could he have been so blind? The woman who had accepted her fine without protest wasn't just another person in his courtroom. She was a leader in a field he could barely comprehend. He wondered how many times he had made similar assumptions about others in his career. How many lives had he touched with snap judgments, missing the complexity beneath the surface? The unease that had begun to settle in his chest now grew into something more substantial: guilt. He had judged her based solely on the surface, on her quiet demeanor and appearance. He had assumed that, like so many others, she was someone to be dealt with quickly and efficiently. But Cassandra was far from ordinary. She was changing the world in ways that most people would never even understand. He couldn't just let this go. He needed to know more, needed to make things right in some way. For the first time in a long while, Harper felt compelled to take action, not as a judge, but as a man realizing the depth of his own oversight. He would find a way to apologize, to make amends for the mistake he had made. Cassandra Brown was not just a defendant. She was a force of change, and he needed to understand her story before it was too late. The days following his discovery were filled with an unease that Judge Harper had never quite experienced before. As the usual court cases rolled in, his mind constantly drifted back to Cassandra Brown. He couldn't shake the thought of how easily he had dismissed her in the courtroom, categorizing her as just another traffic violator when, in reality, she was a visionary, a leader in a field far beyond his own understanding. The weight of this realization was heavy, and with it came the humbling recognition of how easily biases could shape decisions. The more Harper thought about it, the more ashamed he felt. His job, in part, was to administer justice, yet he had made a decision based on assumptions that had nothing to do with her actions, her background, or the life she was living. He had been so quick to judge her by what he saw on the surface, the quiet woman in a courtroom, with no flashy gestures or attempts to plead her case, that he had completely overlooked the depth of her character and the immense contribution she was making behind the scenes. For years, Harper had prided himself on being impartial, fair, and logical. But this moment made him question his own judgment. How many times had he overlooked people who didn't fit the mold of what he expected? How many times had he assumed that someone wasn't important simply because they didn't outwardly demand attention? The question gnawed at him as he sifted through case after case, unable to concentrate fully. The more Harper reflected, the clearer it became that his approach needed to change. He could no longer continue with business as usual. His biases, whether intentional or not, had clouded his ability to see the full picture. What frustrated him most was that it wasn't just an isolated incident. The court system, in general, operated on assumptions, on quick judgments. But those judgments didn't always capture the complexity of the people who walked through its doors. He spent hours reviewing Cassandra's case again, tracing the information he had found on the Army Restructuring Initiative. She had worked tirelessly to push boundaries, to challenge outdated systems that had long gone unchallenged. She wasn't just a woman who quietly accepted her fine. She was someone whose intellect and vision had far-reaching consequences. The military's transformation wouldn't just affect soldiers, it would redefine how wars were fought and how peace was maintained. It was work of immeasurable importance, and Harper had reduced her to nothing more than a name on a docket. By the end of the week, Harper had come to a decision. He could not allow the situation to pass without action. He had to find a way to reach out to Cassandra, to apologize, and to acknowledge the mistake he had made. But it wasn't just about the apology, it was about learning. He needed to truly understand the broader implications of his work, to be more open-minded, to see people for what they were capable of rather than what he assumed them to be. And so, Harper set out to make things right, uncertain of what that would look like but determined to take the first step. It was time to understand Cassandra Brown, not just as a defendant, but as a force in her own right. It was an unusually warm afternoon when Judge Harper decided to reach out to Cassandra Brown. After days of reflection, he realized that an apology alone wouldn't be enough. He couldn't simply express regret for having misjudged her. He needed to do something more meaningful, to truly understand the woman behind the case number. He had to learn her story and recognize the far-reaching impact of her work. Harper didn't quite know where to start, so he took the most straightforward approach. He decided to seek her out, though he knew it wouldn't be easy. Cassandra was a woman of few words in public, and her role in military reform was shrouded in secrecy. Finding her outside the boundaries of the military world wasn't simple, but after a few calls and a bit of research, he managed to find an address for her in a quiet cafe in the city. It was the last place he expected to meet someone with her caliber of influence, yet there she was, sitting at a corner table, quietly reading a book. She was alone, just as composed as she had been in his courtroom. Harper approached her hesitantly, unsure of how she would react to his presence. He had no formal invitation to meet with her, and given the nature of his role, she could easily have dismissed him or refused to engage. But as he stood there, a few steps away from her table, he took a deep breath and made a decision. He wasn't just here to apologize. He was here to learn. "Miss Brown," Harper said softly, his voice tentative. Cassandra didn't flinch or look up immediately, but when she did, there was a quiet recognition in her eyes. She seemed unfazed by his presence, almost as though she had been expecting him. The judge, with his suit and professional demeanor, was out of place in this casual setting, but she regarded him without surprise. "Yes, Your Honor." Her voice was measured, but not cold calm, like it had been in the courtroom, though there was a hint of curiosity in it now. "I owe you an apology," he began, his voice heavier than he intended. "The other day, in court, I made a mistake. I judged you too quickly. I reduced you to something you are not, and I deeply regret it." Cassandra studied him for a long moment, her gaze steady and thoughtful. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but it was heavy with meaning. She didn't speak immediately, and Harper wondered if she might dismiss him, if she might even be offended by his intrusion. But then she nodded slowly. "I appreciate your honesty, Judge Harper," she said, her voice soft but firm. "But understanding and accepting a mistake is only part of the process. What matters is how we move forward from here." Harper nodded, his throat tightening slightly at her words. She wasn't angry, but she wasn't offering him an easy out either. She was right, of course. The apology was just the first step. Now he had to prove through his actions that he truly understood the gravity of his oversight. "I want to learn more about your work," Harper said, his voice steadier now. "Not just the military restructuring, but about you. How you got to where you are, what drives you. If you'll let me, I'd like to hear your story." For a brief moment, Cassandra was silent again, considering. Then she gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. It wasn't one of mockery or cynicism. It was the smile of someone who had been through enough to know that true change didn't come from a single conversation or gesture. It came from real understanding. "Let's talk then," she said. "It's about time," someone asked. And with that, the judge and the military leader sat down, two people from vastly different worlds, beginning a conversation that would change both of them forever. The cafe was quiet, with only a few other patrons scattered around the room, lost in their own conversations or the pages of their books. Harper and Cassandra sat across from one another, two individuals from opposite worlds, bound by a shared moment of realization. The contrast between them was striking. The judge in his neatly pressed suit, the military leader in casual clothes, a woman who had quietly commanded respect in ways Harper had never fully appreciated. He had spent years interpreting the world through his judicial lens, but now, in the face of Cassandra's calm presence, everything he thought he understood seemed far more complicated. "I spent my life thinking about systems," Cassandra began, breaking the silence between them. "The way they work, the way they fail, and how we can make them better. In the military, it's about discipline, but also about adaptation. Things change so fast, and if we're not willing to evolve, we'll be left behind." Harper nodded, his mind racing to catch up. He had seen glimpses of this in his courtroom, of course. People who had fallen through the cracks of a system that wasn't equipped to deal with the complexities of their lives. But hearing it from someone who was actively reshaping a national institution brought a new clarity to the idea. Systems could work, but they could also be flawed in ways that people like Cassandra knew how to fix, while most of the world remained blind to the deeper issues. "So, you're not just thinking about tactics or technology," Harper said slowly, trying to understand. "You're thinking about the people within those systems, how they fit together, how they're supported, how they work beyond the rules." "Yes," Cassandra answered, her voice quiet but powerful. "It's always about people. The best systems are built to adapt to human strengths and weaknesses, not just blindly follow rigid protocols. In the military, we often get so focused on what's on the surface, on the weapons, the training, the strategy, that we forget the most important part, the people who have to carry out those strategies. Their morale, their belief in what they're doing. That's what wins wars. Not just the technology or the tactics." Harper absorbed her words, feeling a sense of awe at the depth of her vision. She wasn't just speaking in abstract terms. She was talking about a fundamental shift in the way the world viewed strength and leadership. It wasn't about commanding through force, but about leading through understanding and innovation. He could feel the weight of her responsibility in every word she said, and for the first time, he wondered if he had been too focused on justice within a limited framework. He had been upholding laws, but Cassandra was redefining what it meant to lead. "You're changing an entire system," he said, more to himself than to her. "And yet, from what I saw in court, you don't ask for recognition. You're not out for the spotlight. You just do the work." Cassandra smiled softly, a hint of warmth in her eyes. "That's the way it has to be, Judge. The work isn't about the recognition. It's about the change we can make in the world, however quietly we do it." For the first time, Harper understood what she meant. Her quiet demeanor in court hadn't been a sign of submission. It had been a reflection of her inner strength, of someone whose focus was never diverted by the noise around her. She was doing the hard, invisible work, and in her own way, she was changing the world. He realized that in his previous judgments, he had missed so much. "What's next for you?" Harper asked, genuinely curious now. More work, Cassandra replied, her voice steady. More obstacles to overcome. But every challenge is an opportunity, and I'm ready for it. As the conversation continued, Harper was struck by how much he still had to learn. Cassandra had shown him not just the scope of her work, but the depth of her character. The woman sitting before him was more than a defendant or even a military leader. She was someone who embodied resilience, vision, and a commitment to change in ways he had never fully understood. And in that moment, Harper realized that it wasn't just his understanding of Cassandra that needed to change. It was his entire perspective on leadership, justice, and what it meant to truly make a difference. As the conversation with Cassandra stretched on, Judge Harper found himself shifting in ways he hadn't anticipated. Each of her words challenged a long-standing assumption, not only about the military or leadership, but about the very nature of progress and how change comes about. The ease with which she spoke of systemic reform, of quietly shaping the future with unwavering determination, made Harper reconsider his own role in society. He had spent decades thinking in terms of rules and regulations, of the rigid structure of the law, but Cassandra was thinking in terms of people, how they thrived, how they struggled, and how they could be better supported, in or out of a system. As they talked, Cassandra revealed more about the project she was overseeing. How, in her role, she had become a crucial figure in modernizing not just the armed forces, but the very notion of what it meant to be part of something greater than oneself. Her plans involved not only technological advancements, but cultural shifts, teaching soldiers to think critically, to understand the human cost of conflict, and to approach every challenge with adaptability, rather than reliance on old methodologies. It wasn't about simply creating more efficient warriors. It was about creating better people, better leaders. It's a hard path, Cassandra admitted, her voice calm but with the weight of experience behind it. The military isn't known for its willingness to change. Many of the people I work with are resistant to anything that challenges the status quo. But the world is changing too fast to remain stagnant. We have to evolve, and that starts with understanding that everything is connected. How we treat the people in the system, how we foster collaboration, how we use technology, and above all, how we see each other. Harper, who had always seen the military as a formidable but rigid institution, now found himself wondering if he had misunderstood it all. He thought of all the soldiers he had seen in his courtroom over the years, often dismissed as just another face, just another case. What if, instead of seeing them as statistics or problems to be solved, he had seen them as people who needed the right kind of leadership, the right kind of environment to grow? I think I've been blind to that, he said quietly. I've always thought of the system as something to be enforced, something that keeps order. But it seems like real progress comes from creating systems that allow people to grow, to adapt. Cassandra nodded, her gaze steady. Exactly. True leadership is about fostering the potential in others, not forcing them into a mold. That's how real change happens, when people feel empowered, not controlled. Harper was silent for a moment, reflecting on her words. The courtroom, the structure he had once viewed as an immutable pillar of justice, suddenly seemed less like a final authority and more like a platform for understanding and growth. Could it be that he, too, was part of the system that needed to change? I don't know how I can make that kind of change, Harper said, almost to himself. But I know I need to try. Cassandra's expression softened, and for the first time, Harper saw the fullness of her conviction. It starts with one step, one decision, and from there, you build. As the conversation came to a close, Harper felt a deep sense of gratitude, not just for the apology he had made, but for the new perspective he had gained. He had come here thinking he was reaching out to apologize for a mistake, but instead, he had found a mentor in someone he had never truly understood. Cassandra had taught him that change didn't always have to be loud or immediate. Sometimes it came in the quietest of moments, in the simplest of conversations. As he left the cafe, Harper couldn't help but think that, perhaps for the first time in his career, he was beginning to see the true value of leadership, justice, and progress. And it was all thanks to a woman who had quietly, yet profoundly, reshaped the way he saw the world.